Hi, this is Rohin. You're listening to the free version of the First Principles podcast. It is only one part of the full episode that we release for our premium subscribers. If you'd like to listen to future episodes the very first day they're released as one complete conversation, then please consider upgrading to our premium version. You can do that either by subscribing to the Ken's premium plan, which unlocks all our premium podcasts via our subscriber apps, or you can just subscribe to the Ken's premium channel on Apple Podcasts for a really affordable monthly subscription price. That will unlock all our premium podcasts. Our premium podcasts include First Principles, of course, but also 2 by 2 The Nut Graph, and Make India Competitive Again. Check the show notes for links to all of these. Now, back to the episode, and thank you for listening. Delhivery, the logistics company, started out in Delhi. It even has Delhi in its name, literally. Yet, a few weeks ago, I flew to Goa to meet its co founder and CEO, Sahil Barua, because that's where Delhivery's headquarters are now. It was a day trip. I took an early morning flight, spent a few hours at a quaint cafe where I was the only guest, then walked about 15 minutes through very still and hot back alleys filled with cashewnut and mango trees before ending up on a dusty highway dodging traffic next to an under construction flyover. By the time I got to the studio I was meeting Sahil at, my adventure quota for the day was almost over. I loved it. This was the first time I was meeting Sahil. We'd only exchanged emails with each other. He's tall, lean, and bearded. There's a certain air of seriousness, for want of a better word, to him, a professorial sort. I steeled myself, expecting our conversation to be a bit stiff. But Sahil completely surprised me because he felt completely at ease diving into answers, explanations, and reflections without any hesitation. It wasn't impulsiveness, but a certain ease with his own thoughts and actions which did not require polishing or editing before being shared. It was something that kept coming up time and again in my conversation with him. From joining consulting firm Bane right around the time they had set up shop in India, to signing up for a triathlon without much regard for what the challenge holds, to moving delivery to, well, Goa. But at Delhivery, as it has become a giant in the e-commerce and logistics business, he tells one thing to his employees.
Delivery, there are two things we tell everyone without fail. One is do not move fast and break things. Actually, that is something that we actually say in induction. Don't move fast, don't break things. Because at our scale, it doesn't make sense. And the second thing that we tell everybody is that the good thing about operations is also the bad thing about operations in our business, which is you're only as good as you were yesterday. Nothing matters. I can't go to a customer, or if I screwed up your shipping from 2 months ago, or I did a great job 2 months ago and I lose your package tomorrow, I can't come and say, hey, Rohan, so I get a mulligan for, doing a good job 2 months ago. So that's the other thing at least I keep telling people, and we keep reminding them that, every day is a new day. So you forget everything you knew yesterday.
Delhivery might not be a sexy business from the outside, but the systems they have built and continue to build, as Sahil explains, position it as a company that is always innovating and iterating in a sector which has largely remained the same for decades. And as Sahil repeated in different ways, the biggest effort they have taken is building the most effective network out there. Sahil tracks Delhivery's journey, how he and his co-founders built a logistics network in the image of a telecom network, and how he has grown to be a better and calmer founder over the years. I talked to Sahil Barua, co-founder and CEO of Delhivery, about that and a lot more during the course of our conversation. This is Rohin Dharmakumar, your host. Welcome to First Principles. I apologize for the slightly lower quality of the audio this time. We're recording from a different studio. Thank you for understanding. Let's get started. Sahil, you were the last guest I emailed before First Principles, in some senses, died. I emailed you last April, and then last June we killed first principles. Right? We said we bring it to a stop. We put on an episode called Last Principles, and it died, and it was dead for almost a year. Till last month, we revived it. And now here we are in Goa sitting face to face. So, in some senses, first principle had to die and be reborn for me to kind of be sitting next to you in this conversation. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm glad you're back.
No, I'm thrilled. I also want to quickly read out what you'd written back to me in April last year when I first wrote to you and saying we should meet. I quote, "While delivery has been around for a long time in startup years, the reality is our first principles are still being proved. We've delivered precisely one publicly declared profitable PAT quarter, that's profit after tax, in 12 years since inception, and many of our deeply held thesis and first principle design elements are still being constructed and put together as we speak. Our industry plays out in decadal cycles and change is slow and difficult, while our foundational beliefs and approach to business remain consistent. I don't believe I have acquired sufficient proven insight or credentials or experience for that matter to be confidently be of use to your listeners. I disagreed with you back then, and I will disagree with you today as well. But it's interesting that you said our first principles are still being created, proven out, etc., and change in your sector happens over decadal cycles, right? So perhaps it's a great time for me to ask, what are your first principles?
Sure. The fundamental first principle of delivery is, the easiest way to explain it is that you can integrate all of India's logistics into sort of logistics requirements into a single, highly unique sort of network structure. I won't get into sort of a huge amount of network theory and why we believe that is to be the case. But historically, when you look at India, when we started out, mail companies were what parcel companies were at the time, the likes of a DTDC or a First Flight, Blue Dart for that matter. Mail companies never did freight. Freight companies never did mail. Part truck companies never did full truck. Full truck companies rarely did part truck. Warehousing companies didn't do transportation. Transportation companies didn't do warehousing. And one of our first principles was that there's no reason for all of this to sort of be as disparate as it looks. The second was that India's network, the fundamental network that you need to deliver high quality, low cost logistics in India, fortunately or unfortunately, fortunately for us, unfortunately because it takes a long time to build this out, you can't unfortunately borrow a model from outside India, bring it here and say, this classic, we can look at FedEx and say we can build a FedEx kind of model in India and so on. And so again, one of the first principles was how do you construct...
What does that mean when you say we cannot build a FedEx model in India?
So let me explain. The history of logistics is interesting, right? When you look at, let's say, the FedExes or the UPSs of the world, and you could substitute this with any company in Europe or so on. These are sort of classic hub and spoke, gigantic hub and spoke networks, which are in some senses marvels of industrial engineering, sort of old school industrial engineering. And I mean old school as a compliment, not as a diss at all. You buy something in the US, for example, or you buy something from India, from the US, it will typically transit via Memphis. And from there, it'll typically transit, let's say, via Dubai or CDG, and then which is Paris, and then make its way to India. Logistics networks have historically been built around this concept of aggregation at specific points and then redistribution to wide spokes. They worked in sort of a 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s environment, largely because they reduce the computational complexity of the network. And they're also what we call sort of at Delhivery, locally scalable networks. What you need to build a hub and spoke network is just 2 points. And when you have those 2 points, you maximize traffic through them, you reduce cost. What they don't do well, though, is when demand and supply are vastly distributed as they are in India, they add sort of time to every package that's moving. Imagine if you had to go from Chandigarh to Ahmedabad and you have to per force route through Delhi and Bombay because you've decided that those are your hubs, you're adding time, you're adding cost. And we realized that those older models didn't work in India for 2 reasons. One is because India is so widely distributed And the second was that fundamentally we now had this new set of tools which allowed us to compute in real time, which you didn't have, earlier in let's say the late.
What does that mean? What kind of tools?
Simple example: when a package comes into Chandigarh, do I want to route it to, let's say, Rajkot via a combination of Delhi, Jaipur, Ahmedabad, Rajkot? Do I want to go Chandigarh straight to Ahmedabad? The ability to calculate how a package should move in real time and what other packages it should move with. This is a non-trivial sort of question. Doing it in real time requires massive computational resources which weren't available easily.
Oh, so you literally meant computational resources.
I literally meant computational resources. And even some of the algorithms are, of course, well understood, but taking them to real time is extremely complex. The second is the orchestration that you need to actually move these packages around within your facilities. The automation didn't exist. Even when delivery started out, we had a tough time until we actually got to a point where we could automate. So that's sort of what I meant by saying the first principle was, can you construct this kind of a network? The hard part of delivery when we started out, and the first principle that we're still sort of proving in some senses, we actually wrote out in 2011 saying this is what a network for India would look like.
2011 is when you started.
When we started. We spent our
So
first...
you were fairly prescient. You were fairly small when you started, a bunch of you. But yet in 2011 itself, you went ambitious and tried to create like a vision.
The line between ambition, overconfidence and stupidity is not sort of, that.
I mean, that's a great point, right? Like, because it should blur. Because at the point when you're making something which is very ambitious or very stupid, you shouldn't know that. It's only hindsight that probably tells you which one.
And like I've said, there are a million different alternate universes where delivery does not succeed. We've been lucky to be in this one, where a lot of things from an execution standpoint came together. But our idea was simple. We said, if we cannot conceptualize the network, we shouldn't build it, because then we have no idea what we're executing towards.
Just for clarity, back then, you were essentially focused on primarily hyperlocal deliveries for restaurants and
That's
right?
correct. We went from food, e-commerce.
That's right.
And then sort of started expanding.
So at that point, even though you were focusing on a fairly narrow use case, you were trying to generalize and draw decadal map of what things might look like.
As far as we could see.
All right.
At that time, we didn't know it would take decades.
Why was that? Was that because you were all ex-consultants and MBAs and therefore the strategy and the vision? Because again, to use your analogy, in so many parallel universes, a set of entrepreneurs would be, let's just nail what we have right now and get to product market fit, and then we'll see what else to do. I just want to understand what made you folks kind of divert some mental cycles to this 10-year vision as well at that point.
So the five of us actually share a couple of things in common, which is why we went down that path. One is Suraj, Mohit and I used to work at Bane together, and not so much as consulting certainly is very helpful, but we weren't there long enough, I would argue, to sort of have absorbed much of the value. But we were lucky to work in telecom from 2008 to 11.
The networks comes from there.
Yes, absolutely. And what we worked on actually was network planning. And we were trying to figure out where you should place, base stations and where you should
network
build.
optimization part, right?
That's
and packets, really. I mean, if I abstract out, in a telecom network, you're routing packets, you're doing some version of that in delivery
That is the story of delivery. Very bluntly, the story of delivery is in some senses borrowed entirely from telecom.
And to kind of go back to your original, when we started the conversation, you said, how should packets be routed? It's essentially the design of TCP/IP, which is essentially what's the most efficient way to route a packet from point A to point B without it necessarily having to go through points of failure or centralized infrastructure.
You're absolutely correct.
Interesting.
That's where we started from. And the idea from telecom and why we said integrated networks make sense is you can actually multi-channel voice and data through effectively the same band of spectrum. And so the question was, if I can do that, why can't I move parcel and freight on the same rails? Why do I need to build separate rails for them? We realized, of course, over time that there were very good reasons why people hadn't done them in the past, but we couldn't exactly understand why the rules of the past would sort of work for the future. And that's sort of one of the many first principles that delivery is constructed on. And our hypothesis was the lowest cost, highest fidelity networks that you can think of are the internet and telecom networks. You can't have a situation where you say something on a phone call and I hear it, 3 minutes later, or that half of it drops off. Or, your internet, obviously, you can't be in a situation where you click on a site and it takes 8 minutes for it to load. And so we said we have to borrow from these networks and not from physical networks. And that's what we have to design for. And that's effectively all that we've been doing for 14 years.
Interesting. We'll come back to this. I mean, I love this analogy, or I mean, I'm sure you don't see it as an analogy, but you see it as a literal representation of deliveries, packages compared to internet packets. But I'm very interested because the inspiration came from a different space, right? But we'll come to that. I flew from Bengaluru to Goa, and I'm glad I did. And we are sitting here. You used to be in Delhi. Your company is literally called Delhivery. It's not called Goa-very. Sorry for that, PJ. How did you end up in Goa?
It's a long story. Our big offices were Delhi, Bombay, and Bangalore. Delhi obviously being central.
So why were you called Delhivery?
We couldn't come up with a better name. We were called the delivery company. It wouldn't fit on visiting cards. And we didn't have a name. And then Suraj was driving over from Gurgaon to Faridabad one evening. And I think his radio on his car wasn't working. So he said that inspired him to think about the name of the company. And he called us and he said, I've thought about it. Why don't we just drop the and company and put an H in delivery? And Mohit and I weren't, to be perfectly honest, enthusiastic about the idea. We said, look, yeah, really. And then he said, do you have a better idea? And we said, actually, we don't. And we said, let's try it. And that actually wasn't the moment that cemented it. Interesting. Most companies, when they start out, the first city, even if it's Delhi or whatever it is, the second city is usually Bangalore. Delhi, Bangalore are the first two cities you go and launch. We said
reason being, that's where the most density of e-commerce.
I think in general, there's e-commerce is there, populations are large. We sort of said we're going to try Chennai. And so the second city that we ever launched was Chennai, because we said if the name delivery works in Chennai, we could make this work absolutely anywhere else. And so we landed up. We had our t-shirts.
Stress testing the company's
name. We stress tested the name. And surprisingly, people in Chennai weren't super irritated to see a company called Delhivery. In fact, they stopped us a couple of times and said the spelling is wrong. And, it stuck. And then before you know it, 5 years down the line, we hadn't bothered to change it.
And then after that, it becomes too complex.
It's too complex to change
it.
Yeah.
All right. So, and how do you end up in Goa?
Yeah, how we ended up was, we spent a lot of time in these big cities. While we were doing only e-commerce, it made sense because, the bulk of e-commerce is still out of Delhi and Bangalore. You have Flipkart in Bangalore, you have Amazon in Bangalore, you had Snapdeal in Delhi. But we realized about 8 years in really, that two things were happening. One is we were acquiring a completely unnecessary capability as an organization, which was building offices. We would move from one office to another and we'd outgrow it. And then, it became a huge headache. And then at some point it was like, we need a campus. And Ajit, our CFO, at the time we sat down, he's like, look, this is not what I want to, this is not what I'm good at. And I don't want to build this capability at all in the company. And we said, that's fair. And the second thing is we realized that all companies create jobs across a wide variety of pay scales. And what we realized is that wage inflation was not keeping up with real inflation. And so the reality is we were employing people who over a period of time, we just weren't able to pay them enough to keep up with how much transportation was, sort of inflating, how much rent was inflating, how much food was inflating. And that meant that people who worked at delivery outside of the equity that you could give them, but equity at that time is, a private company. You never know when it'll sort of become real. People were becoming actively poorer working at delivery, which didn't seem to make any sense because you want people to stay with the company a while. And so people would hop jobs naturally. Somebody would give them a raise, they would go somewhere else. So we said the only way to solve this problem is to get out of the top 3 cities. We have to go to tier 2 cities. We have to go to places that other people haven't been. And as a company, for us, it doesn't matter. We're in 3,000 cities, so we could literally spawn an office anywhere. And so we picked, we shortlisted a bunch of places. We said we need connectivity. We need a place that's not going to be, too far away from sort of at least 1 or 2 major cities. Reasonable density of educational institutions so we can hire on the ground. Goa had all of that. The other advantage is excellent infrastructure. We genuinely believe that what Goa looks like today, Goa highest per capita GDP outside of Delhi. So our belief is that what Goa looks like today is sort of what India should look like as you sort of go up the income curve. So it's a great test bed in some senses for us, English-speaking population, no competition. And that's how we ended up here,
When was that?
2018. So
You moved to Goa as well?
Yes, I did. 2018. Sameep, who was my chief of staff, head of control tower at the time, and 2 of his team members and I, 4 of us moved here. 1 month in, we were 8. 6 months in, we were 40. 12 months in, we were 100 people. I think now 7 years out, we're about 450 in Goa. So pretty big office.
Fascinating. Last question, which is in some senses related to the email exchange that we had, which is, I'd written to you last April. I said, I don't use WhatsApp. You said you don't use WhatsApp as well. Does that still remain true?
Yes.
Why do you not use WhatsApp?
I have found limited use for WhatsApp. The people who I need to talk to on a regular basis are able to reach me without needing WhatsApp. I prefer to speak to them on the phone if I have to. It's just much easier. There's a certain, I believe that having a synchronous conversation is just much more useful than leaving a message for somebody that they see at some point. That was one. The second reason, obviously, is it's actually personal and funny, perhaps, in a way, right? You have these fake messages that come on WhatsApp. And my dad got one of them saying, this is from Sahil and I need money. Fortunately, that day he called me up and he said, why do you need money? And, I'll transfer it, but why do you need money? So who told you I need money? And he sent it to me. And then I realized that it was so easy to sort of pretend to be somebody else. And if someone wasn't looking, they would just, respond on my behalf. So I realized it was much easier to just say, I do not have WhatsApp. If you get any messages from me on WhatsApp, it's not me. And
how long ago was this?
It's been a while. The only time I had WhatsApp was for 6 months during the second wave of COVID because we were coordinating all these oxygen concentrators and stuff. But outside of that, I had it probably for a while before.
Do you use social media?
No, I don't.
So it's a pattern. So it's not just to avoid impersonation. It is also probably what a desire to kind of have less distractions.
That's one. The second is I haven't found any requirement that is met by being in my life. That's met by
social
being
media.
On social media.
Doesn't it create its own requirement once you get addicted enough to it?
I suppose. I did have Instagram a long time back. I think I had 6 photos on it. And I think maybe 9 followers. But I don't know. On social media, there's several things, right? One is it's just I don't see the point of posting stuff about myself for people to consume. It doesn't, why would people be interested in that is a good question. The second is I have, over a long period of time, decided how and where I want my information to come from. And I don't want to upset that. So I am unfortunately a creature of habit. And I realized it's very hard. We were just talking about this earlier. It's so hard to figure out on the internet what's real, what's not. I don't want to get into that at all. And
how does communication happen internally within, between your colleagues, second level reportees, third level reportees, etc.? Do you use some kind of in-house tool or etc.? I'm not talking, not calls, but other than calls, what else do you use? Is it Slack? Is it Microsoft Teams?
No. Obviously we use Zoom, etc. for when we need to have larger calls, but we use GChat when we need to because it's instant. But a lot of the time, it's either in person or we speak on the phone. The good thing is we don't, in a business of our kind, we don't have to speak to each other that often. It's not very necessary. And in fact, I would prefer that the company communicates frequently, but in a sort of, how should I put it, in a consolidated fashion, rather than sort of in this fragmented, we've got messages going from everybody.
What does consolidated mean?
Messages, let me put it this way. If I wanted to talk about, I don't know, let's say HR policy is coming up, we need to talk about our financials at the end of a quarter. There's any important announcement that we need to make.
How do teams talk to each other? Forget, let me take you out of the equation. So all these, in some senses, HR,
there's a lot of in-person work, man. I mean, we're an operations business, right? We have probably 200 big sites. Our heads of operations, me included, we travel to sites, show up, look at what's happening on the ground, talk to people on the ground. It's far more effective than doing it through a screen. So we're still pretty sort of in-person heavy as a company. We do use chat, we do use Zoom, obviously, but the effort is now more and more to sort of do it in person and on the ground, or to decentralize entirely. You don't need central teams sort of looking after things unnecessarily.
So from telecom to sending parcels to finally communication, that theme will continue to play out of decentralizing.
It's faster, it's more effective.
All right. How do you end up? I mean, take me back to when you started, you and your co-founders started Delhivery. 3 of you were ex-consultants at Bane. You spent about 3 years there. How do you folks end up picking the space of delivery? Because per my research, I don't think you worked in delivery. I don't know about your other co-founders. You majored in finance. You spent 3 years with Bain. You were working in India and London.
That's
right? How do you folks end up? What was the series of either events or thoughts or discussions that ended with all of you saying that let's start doing this in this space?
Yeah, so it's a series of unfortunate events. We were at Bain, and Dipinder and Pankaj were at Bain at the same time. They were running what is then called Foodie Bay, which would go on to become obviously Zomato. And
no one's talked about the Bane Mafia, right? Like people keep talking about the PayPal Mafia, but someone ought to talk about the Bane Mafia.
There's a little bit of a Bane Mafia now. But yeah, so they were doing menu aggregation and online ordering at that time. Not online, I mean, you could call on the phone and place orders. And while we quit and they were working on this, we said, look, how come no one delivers for the restaurants? Why is this not aggregated? And at the time they said, look, we're not going to be doing any food logistics, etc. But, if you guys want to do it, we'd be very happy to introduce you to all of our customers. So we said, sure, why not? Let's go and meet restaurants. And so we started going and meeting restaurants.
So was it scratching a personal itch in the sense that as people who wanted to order something, did you feel like it would be great? Or was it was it a strategic fit where you said that, look, in this market, if Dipinder and all are trying to automate this, there will always be a gap to do delivery as well. Which one was it?
It was neither actually, Rohin. It was pure accident. We were just spitballing ideas at the time. We were just talking to them, I remember, on the terrace of their office in DLF Phase 2. And this just came up.
Of ex-Zomato's office.
Foodie and this literally just came up. And then Suraj and I said, look, why not go and just talk to some restaurants and understand what the hell is going on? And that is where it began. Then, interestingly, Abhishek Goyal knew Mohit. And he sort of said, look, if you guys can deliver food and that's what you're thinking about, have you ever considered delivering packages for e-commerce companies? And we were a bit surprised. We said, why? How does this make any sense? Why do you not have Blue Dart and FedEx? And he said, well, for a variety of different reasons that you're going to have to figure out, it's not very effective for us. So we said, sure, we'll go and, let's go and figure this out. So we went over to Blue Dart, to the center in the Galleria market in Gurgaon. And I remember Suraj and I lived on opposite sides of it, and we said, here's a book. I want you to go and deliver this to Suraj, who lives across the road. And the guy said, look, it'll cost you some 240 rupees or something, and it'll get there, probably next day. So we looked at each other and we said, this doesn't sound, given all of our training from telecom, everything we've thought about, this seems a bit odd. It shouldn't take this long and it costs way too much. And that's when we sort of realized something was going on. And so we asked the Blue Dart guy, how does your network work? Where does this box go to when I give it to you? And he was pretty kind. He sort of gave us a run through of how the network worked. And that's when we realized.
What was it? Like they would pick it up from there, take
collection
it to a central
goes to a sort center, comes back, gets sorted, goes to a different distribution center, goes out and gets delivered.
So it makes 3-4 hops before crossing the road.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is this was same day delivery back in 2011, right? And we said, this can't be how logistics will work in urban India.
I must say, much of it hasn't changed. Just about a month ago, I had to send, a piece of apparel that I'd bought from some, one of these D2C startups, which is based in Delhi. and I went to a local Blue Dart and I said, I want to send it. And I think I paid somewhere between 300 to 400 rupees for it to be sent to Delhi in 2 days. Right? So it's not that it's become, and I'm sure there are nuances that I am not the customer they are serving, and this is not the packet that they're prioritizing. Therefore, they will charge me more and deprioritize it. But to your point about sending that book, what was true back then hasn't fundamentally changed a lot. If you're an end user, for the businesses, I'm sure it's changed quite a lot.
That is true. That is true. And that is sort of why my other statement saying our industry plays out in decadal cycles. The reality is a service that belongs in the sort of early 2000s will persist. This is going to continue for a while.
You said something very interesting. Sorry, I'm interrupting you. You used the phrase in a different context. I'll explain, which is reverse Robin Hood strategy.
Yes.
Right? To quote what you said, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you were talking about the, what is that? The part truck? Is that
the part truck business is one of our businesses,
right? Where essentially trucks are going across India and then they only carry some part of their entire load, and therefore if someone wants to send only a little bit, I mean, your point was that if you're a small business that wants to send just maybe 1/10th or 1/20th of what's in the truck, you get charged a lot. Effectively, you end up subsidizing the large businesses.
That's right.
Right? So to come back to this point, it looks to me like I, as an end consumer, paying, let's say, $400 to send like a 150-gram t-shirt from Bangalore to Delhi over 2 days, is subsidizing some large company, which will essentially do like, get maybe like 1/5 of that rate and like, 1/3 of that time. So that still exists.
Yes, that is part of one of the many first principles of it. When I talk about cost, that is what it is. See, traditionally, when I say reverse Robin Hood, ours is a Robin Hood strategy. The reverse Robin Hood is you steal from the poor to give to the rich, which is essentially you charge SMEs an arm and a leg, or you charge consumers an arm and a leg to ship something, but you have to sort of massively subsidize your enterprise customers.
Sorry. To kind of explain why that happens, I'm assuming the implication is that you're an individual or you're a small person. You're not giving me, because all Indians in some senses understand this at a very fundamental level, that you're not giving me enough business, you're not giving me enough dhanda, so I'm going to charge you a lot. You can't expect the same price or commitment that I get from this other big business because they give me a lot of business. So this, at a very first principle level, this is what in some senses we have all accepted. Yeah, I get it. I'm only giving you this small piece of business, so I guess you're going to charge me extra for it. What can I do? What option do I have? If this is reverse Robin Hood, what is your Robin Hood strategy?
So I'll explain, right? The classic thinking is that your enterprise, in our kind of business, enterprise buyers form a large base, because of which you can think of them potentially even in some extreme situations as loss leaders. You sort of say they fill my network, and because they fill my network, I give them this extremely aggressive pricing, but now I still need to make returns. Now, how do I do it? I go to you and I go to an SME and I say, well, do you want to ship? And they say, yes, but you don't have bargaining power. So you sort of go, for lack of a better analogy or a sort of way to think about it, it's sort of, Porter's five forces. You have, fragmented buyers and you've got a consolidated supplier. And so they have pricing power. Our view was that while a part of this is correct, yes, you do need large base loads to make a network work. The right question is, what is the differential between the price that your smallest customer and your biggest customer should pay? Let's say today, as an example, logistics is a good example. I won't use India. Let me use the US as an example. A very large buyer versus a retail buyer of logistics in the US, cost will vary possibly up to as much as 4 or 5x between the two per unit. What we said is
sometimes you lose the meaning of that. That's 400 to 500%.
That's right.
Right? Because sometimes when we say 4 to 5x, it just kind of makes it easier.
You pay so if you were paying, if a big company was paying $1, as a consumer, you'd be paying $4 or $5 or even more. We said that doesn't have to be that large. The principle of delivery was design the network for the smallest user, find the lowest possible cost at which you can serve, and then reverse build and say, what is it that the bigger customers, what's the pricing that you can give bigger customers accordingly, rather than the other way around, saying, I have my biggest customers and this is what I can charge them. And then I work out what I need from the smaller customer to make my business work. So
This is telecom networks as
again,
well,
it's
right?
not dissimilar. It's not dissimilar.
Because
Right?
a packet of YouTube's traffic is similar to a packet of some
That's
other
right.
small site's traffic.
That's right. Telecom is very interesting because the central capex aside of building the fiber and obviously building the larger switching centers, the unit of a telecom network is a base station. And if you use a base station and you can find 1,000 consumers in the base station, back then it used to be, I think, 1,500 for a GSM tower or whatever. If you could find, I think, 1,500 users, the consolidated traffic would be sufficient for you to be able to give them a very low price at which they could buy voice or data. And it didn't matter then whether it was Sahil, the individual consumer, Delhivery, the company, or whoever else. So we said we have to find that unit. And that really, a lot of the times in logistics, the thinking we've found is upside down. You think about your bigger units first. How do I build the hubs? How do I build the gateways? And then build the spokes of the network in service of the bigger unit. We said you have to go the other way. You have to build the smallest unit first and then sort of construct the network as a sequence of the smaller units.
Help me understand this in the context of delivery zone evolution. What were some of the smaller customers or units you built for as you were growing and evolving?
See, simplest way to think about it is, or how it manifested in how we built out, right? When we started, we had one delivery center in Gurgaon. And we said, until we realize how to do Gurgaon to Gurgaon delivery using this one center at the lowest possible cost, we will not add a second center anywhere in the city or the country. What a lot of businesses, which we weren't the only business to start this in 2011, there were multiple others. They tried to build the network argument first, saying we have 6 centers in Gurgaon, we've got 10 centers in Delhi, we've got 20 centers in Bombay, and we'll connect all of these and you can ship with us all over the place. And we said, no, that doesn't make sense because I'm not learning what the unit, how to perfect that one distribution center. Now, when we started doing that, when we started getting to the delivery center, 2 or 3 things started happening. One is we said, how do I route traffic effectively within the catchment of a delivery station? Is today at least more important than how I route inter-center. And we started saying, what are the things that affect this? 2 things that came out straight away. One was address quality. In India, it's still extremely poor, right? How do you know where someone really lives? In e-commerce, especially, people write addresses which are just probabilistic estimates of, where they are. And you sort of then have to call them and find them. And we said, this doesn't work. Logistics is a precise business. We have to be able to find people. The second was traffic. We said, how do we avoid traffic at all of the critical hours of delivery? Which means I don't want riders going out into... let me break this up as an example. Let's say in Bombay, there's the old adage that you never cross the highway, right? When you don't cross the Western Expressway or the Eastern Expressway, as long as you're on one side of it or between the 2 expressways, you're broadly fine. So we said most cities have this interesting topographical structure where there are these little units that are consistent and then they're separated from other units by a highly trafficked road. How do you create this geographical separation in your systems? Which is when we realized, as an example, that the pin code doesn't work because the pin code encompasses, traffic regions. This. How do you split it? So that's an example of sort of how we said the unit has to be perfect. We have to find how to identify. We have to find how to define this unit in our systems. It cannot be I can't say my center in Gurgaon services South City. That doesn't mean anything. What is South City? Because South City may be split by a road. And how do my systems understand this? How do I understand addresses on one side versus the other? So we built that unit. That was one part.
To use your book example, the DHL, Blue Dart, which one was it? How did you eventually end up optimizing for that to send the same book from one side of the road to the other?
Gurgaon to Gurgaon, as an example, if it were going within the same distribution center, it'll never hit any other point in the network.
So you give it and then from there someone picks it up and only delivers
The systems recognize instantly that this is a completely local order. There's no reason to do anything to this pack. Just it's arrived, just go and drop it off wherever you need to, the most direct route. That was, first part was in center, which is just within that same center. The second is when we built the second one and we built the third one, we built the next 2 were, I think, Malviya Nagar in Delhi and I'm going to say, I forget, it was West Delhi, somewhere, Janakpuri. And we said, now we have a triangle of centers. How do you connect a triangle? Then it became, how do you connect more than a triangle? I think then we went to East Delhi and then we went to the north. And we said, now we have a pentagon. How do you connect the pentagon? Where it starts becoming interesting is, as you sort of today, Delhi has 140 centers, right? You have essentially, you could argue, you've got a 140-sided polygon with everything else being interconnected. You have too many sort of different options, which are all subscale. That's when we started saying, now that you have a pentagon, you have a hexagon, you're getting more complicated as a network, you need what is telecom's equivalent of a base switching center or a main switching center. You need a switch in the network. So this routes traffic to a switch. The switch then reroutes it to a bunch of other places. But the switch can't be a hub. The switch has to be dynamic in the sense that depending on traffic at the previous node, you may choose to go to the switch or bypass it entirely. Let's say I have enough traffic from Gurgaon, which is going to East Delhi. I don't need to go through a switch in South Delhi. But if I don't have enough traffic, I should route through South Delhi to make it cost effective and time effective.
So what is, you said the switch should not be a hub. What is it? What is it, a larger distribution center?
It's a larger form sort center effectively. It is a hub, but it's not a hub the way classical logistics would define
because
it.
There the hub, you're saying in classical logistics, you first build the hub and spoke and then you fill it. Here you're saying you kind of discover the hub organically by building it bottoms up.
The way to think about it is every spoke in a classical network will have a one-to-one relationship with the hub. Whereas in our case, every spoke will have a connection with the hub, but will have a many-to-many relationship with many other points in the network.
In fact, I remember one of the stories I think that we did, I'll link to that in the show notes, talks about ultimately all of this for you becoming sort of like a mesh network.
It is a mesh. That is the right way to think about it. It is a mesh. And the most interesting problem,
How do you describe a mesh network for someone who does not understand telecom?
Easiest way to think about it is any point in the network can connect to any other basis what is the state of that original node to begin with. Let's say, again, I'll go back to
there are 140 points in your diagram. Any two of those points could potentially connect directly to each other.
And whether they should connect or not gets determined by our system's basis, what we know about that node, which is how much volume is it carrying.
Interestingly, in telecom also, we've gone through the classical Wi-Fi solutions where there was a centralized thing where each one would beam out to within a home or an office to a mesh network.
A Y-mesh.
Where everything kind of connects to each other and there's an algorithm that determines.
Absolutely. It's not hugely dissimilar. The other reason...
Did you learn? Sorry, I'm just like, while you were building out Delhivery, were you and your colleagues and your experts within who build these networks also studying the evolution of telecom networks? Because I find it fascinating that around the same kind of time, mesh networks are also becoming more and more powerful and complex in telecom. So is there any learning that you folks were kind of looking at, maybe like papers, patents, etc., on how mesh networks are developing in telecom?
We were looking at telecom, we were looking at logistics. I think Kapil and his team have probably looked at how the internet routes traffic. But again, the fundamental principles of network theory haven't changed in, a century. The idea that there is another reason why meshes are interesting as opposed to hub and spoke models, which is the more nodes, interconnected nodes you have in a network, fundamentally the network can achieve greater stability.
It's more resilient.
It's much more resilient. And that was the other reason for us to design from scratch, saying we need a network which is resilient. Simple example, right? In the winter in Delhi in December, by week 2, that flights are going to start getting delayed. By week 3, pushback for most aircraft are typically a couple of hours off. By week 4, till you get to sort of Lodi, you're practically not flying. For all, and also what happens is that aircraft, because of the fact that landing is unpredictable, typically cargo gets offloaded a lot more because pilots have to carry more fuel. Now, at that point, if you run a hub and spoke network and Delhi is your hub, you are unfortunately bound to fail. You're a prisoner of your network's design. Whereas what we realized very early is if we can bypass Delhi at the right times and we can train our systems to bypass Delhi at the right times, I don't have to fly out of Delhi. I pick up in Noida, I route to Lucknow, I route to Chandigarh, I route to Jaipur. And I use those alternate nodes which don't have this effect and essentially then route traffic, wherever else we need to. So that was the other reason. So the fundamental principles of network theory are what we stuck to. But we looked at, like I said, we've looked at telecom networks, we've looked at the internet, and we looked at logistics networks. We looked at them all over the world, from the US to China to Japan, Indonesia, trying to understand how urban topography and
Indonesia must be very complex because it's also a lot of islands. In Southeast Asia, there are multiple places where
it's idiosyncratic, but it's not complex. It's the unique thing about most markets, like Indonesia or Brazil, for example, or Argentina, is they're so dense in one place that the logistics problem is not very hard. Jakarta is such a large part of Indonesian commerce that if you solve for Jakarta, you're okay. Maybe there are 3-4 other cities, I don't know, Surabaya or Medan or something, where getting goods there is complex. But again, there 3-4 points is not very hard. Chinese logistics is not very hard because most of China is up and down the eastern seaboard. The rest of the country is sort of relatively sparsely populated. So we found that India is very unique. You have this diamond, which is complex. Things are produced all over the place. Things are consumed all over the place. And it's a very sort of random, network that you need to design. So we did learn some things, we learned how to navigate traffic better. Indonesia
I was
is,
about to ask you that have authorities from Indian cities ever come to Delhivery and asked you for help in designing traffic flows? Because many of the things that you talk about, congestion, choke points, routing, etc., are true of traffic as well, because cars are packets. In fact, in Bangalore now, I think for the last 6 months or so, we've started progressively moving. Bangalore is one of the worst traffic in India, sadly. We've moved to this new automated system, which is apparently of Japanese origin, where the signals can be switched on into either a manual mode or into an automated mode, where the automated mode, they sense traffic and they dynamically change the signal length on each side. So normally what happens in India is all signals are of fixed signal regardless of traffic. But I think we've started doing this thing where if a particular side's traffic is heavy in the evenings, for instance, because people are returning from office on a particular route, it will get priority and it will be given a green signal for a longer time, as opposed to the other one. I can see that your eyes are going up and you're thinking of the second and third order effects of how this plays out. But for what it's worth, I don't know, maybe there's a marginal 10% difference in many of the routes, etc. So there are cameras that monitor the traffic live and the signals automatically change. But the factor is human, which is at the end of the day, I think the traffic cops have this thing, they feel that nothing is as good as human control. So a lot of time what happens is they switch it off and they, manually run it because we all feel that we can manage it better than any algorithm.
I can see why. I'm surprised that they let it go to an automated mode at all. Traffic's complex. It's a little more complex than packets because packets don't have a prime motion of their own in terms of how they decide where they want to go. Human beings, unfortunately, have objective
and sizes,
functions.
Right? There's a bus, there's a bike, there's a car. Yeah.
And our perception of traffic is as important as the traffic itself, right? Somebody may be happy to be in traffic for 30 minutes and somebody for 5. But packets don't have.
All right. Let me kind of switch back to, your childhood. You grew up in Ahmedabad. Your dad's was a professor at IIM Ahmedabad. I don't know if he's still teaching or not. Your mom was a doctor. I use wars to just merely explain the context of when you were growing up. You got an engineering degree and then you went to IIM Bangalore, right? What was the environment / expectation when you were growing up and you were still in school as to what you would want to do? What role did your parents have in guiding you, conversing with you on what you needed to do?
Yeah, I grew up in an academic environment. I grew up on the campus of IIM Ahmedabad. And I have to say that's possibly the most important thing that's happened in my life. Everything from, there on has been as a consequence
traces
of
back to that
100%,
straight line. Yeah.
100%.
Why?
It's unique when you grow up in an academic environment. 2 things happen. One is there were never really any sort of major expectations of what I should do from either of my parents. I suppose being an academic kind of, and my mom being a doctor, it's perhaps non-commercial is one way to put it. And so in that sense, there was no particular expectation that I would go and do anything specific. The only thing I remember my dad telling me is that, look, make sure you have functional mathematical skills and make sure you have functional skills in language. As long as you have these two things.
What I'm just curious. What did your dad teach at IMI?
Over 30 years, many things, but quantitative methods, corporate finance, corporate governance, and and sort of classic P&Q and portfolio management. My mom's a pediatrician. So a lot of it was, read a lot. We're surrounded by books, so read a hell of a lot. And my dad was, he himself played cricket. His story is that he wanted to go and play for Maharashtra, but his dad didn't let him. So he said, look, make sure you also I was thrown out of the house and said, play whatever you keep. And on a campus, the advantage is you have the ability to do so. So I played badminton, I swam competitively. And that was it. There was no further expectation. I don't think either of my parents thought I should do anything specific. I think my mom possibly wanted me to be a doctor. I'm not sure. It's never been formally stated, but I feel like maybe at that time there were hints. So growing up was just...
consider?
I did briefly. I actually came and wrote the Karnataka CET saying, should I go to, KMC at the time. But I was never too serious about it. I didn't want to be a doctor. I actually wanted to go and study math because I liked it. And that was that. There was never any pressure to do anything of the sort. I think most of it was just read widely, and build a set of functional skills and you'll be fine.
Got it. After your engineering, did you work before going for your MBA?
No, I didn't.
So after your engineering, what made you go for your MBA?
Pure accident, man. I actually ended up in engineering college. I studied mechanical engineering because my dad was a mechanical engineer and I found it interesting enough at the time, I guess, or, everything else was less interesting. I actually, in my final year, I was at the University of Maryland and I, at that point, was harboring this idea of going and getting a master's degree in engineering, combination of electronics and mechanical engineering, but I really didn't like living in the US. So I just said, I'm going to come back. And I told my parents, I like the chaos of India. I just like the, US as a graduate student, it's a very I found it a very depressing life. Yes, you're in a room with 4 guys, you're kind of doing your lab work for 30 hours at a stretch. And I looked at that years out and I said, man, this is not, what I really want to do. Much as I love engineering, I don't love this part of it. And I just like, there's something about the chaos of being in India that I really enjoy. It really, for me, it energizes me. So I want to come back. I had grand plans of taking a year off. So I announced to my parents that I would not do anything for a year. And my dad, possibly sensing that there would be resistance if he tried any other way, said, given that we live on campus, I have the ability to fill out your CAT form in like 5 minutes. So I've done it. And why don't you just show up at the test center and see how it goes? And if it doesn't go well, okay, and do what you want. And if it goes well, we'll talk about it. So I said, fine.
Argue with that.
I couldn't argue with that. That was a fair ask. So I took the CAT. It went okay. And Bangalore and Calcutta were good enough to say, why don't you come for an interview? And that's that. Next thing I know, I was at IIM Bangalore. That's it.
You majored in finance.
We don't have the concept of a major at IIM, but I did most of my courses were in finance and statistics, which is stuff I liked.
What do you remember? What your dream job back then was while you were in second year?
Oh man, I had none. I didn't go to IIT, and so the summer placement was I had a couple of shortlists. Bain was one. I had consulting shortlists: McKinsey, Bain, and HSBC. From what I remember, HSBC said, come and join us in a structuring role in London. And I had no idea what that meant. So I said, look, I don't even know what it is. Why should I do this? Bain was a startup at the time. And they only had, at the time, I think 20 employees in India. And they'd all just moved. So it felt very exciting. And the partners would come were just super friendly. And I said, look, this sounds really exciting. There's only 20 guys here. I have no idea what you do, but I feel like you're nice guys. And so I want to join Bain. So I had no conception of a dream job. I had no idea. I showed up. Bain gave me an opportunity to intern with them. I enjoyed it. And they said, well, would you like to join full time? I said, I don't really have any other plans, so why not? And so that's how I rocked up at Bain. I had no idea about a dream job or anything of the sort, purely by accident.
So it's interesting how many of our life choices in the younger phases are just going along in some senses to a path of least resistance. Like your dad told you, I'll just fill in the cat form and let's see where that goes. And Bain says, join us. And you're like, let's see where this goes, which is actually fine because, I think with the benefit of hindsight and a lot of people, especially because these days things are much more competitive, there is a tendency to overthink all of these choices and think that everything that you do in the early years will eventually, be very crucial and critical. What do you think about now with the benefit of hindsight?
I mean, you had a full event around this, and people made the right points. Absolutely. A career is not a ladder. There's no natural progression of things from, I'm an engineer and then I got an MBA and then I went and worked in whatever, management consulting or banking or sales for Unilever or whatever, and then eventually became a VP of something at some place. I think happy accidents have, at least at Delhivery as we've seen it also, most of the guys who joined us early, right, they joined out of happy accidents. And over time, they've discovered things that they like doing, that they love doing at Delhivery or outside. I think that makes for a more interesting graph. And at the end of the day, you work because you're interested in things, not because it's a logical sequence of events that you need to go through. Of course, as long as you get sufficiently rewarded for it to make sense for you. But I think people overthink it, and competition is also often overstated in people's minds. I don't blame, you go back to, you must have gone back. When you go back to IIM, you suddenly realize everything looks a little more stressful than it was when you were there. And I understand that the students are saying, look, there are more of us at the institute. There are potentially fewer jobs. I think you just have to widen your worldview a little bit and say, sure, what are the alternative options I have outside of going to investment banking or to consulting or to Unilever? And there are so many which are very rewarding. I know guys who've now gone on, and some of my batchmates started a renewable energy company out of campus. Everyone thought they were crazy. One of my friends went and was the first employee for Uber. For no conceivable reason, he said, this sounds very exciting in India. And you realize all of these accidents add up over time. They're more fun, which is at least my view.
If you had to kind of retrofit a theory that kind of unites all these happy accidents that people end up in, how do people consciously end up being okay with the happy accidents? Is there a method to kind of where you say go with these kind of flows or find these kind of situations? Is there any kind of a principle that you can possibly derive from your own happy accidents and those of your colleagues?
You have to look for them. You have to create accidents. There are two ways of doing this. One is the safe path, where you say and it's an entirely acceptable and feasible path, which is to say that there is a path that is well trodden, that makes sense. Millions of people have gone through this. And there's a reason why it makes sense. And that's absolutely okay. And there are many reasons why people may choose that kind of a path. But if you want to you have to collect accidents, is the way I think about it. You have to consciously go out and say, I've never done this before. I'm going to go and try this. For me, as an example, or at Delhivery, one of the things we tell our senior management is go and see if you can work with smaller startups, and see what it's like. That's the easiest thing for us to create as a happy accident for them. For me, one of them was, going and setting up, as an example, an office here. Doing triathlon was a happy accident. It came out of nowhere. And I said, look, I need to do something that's uncomfortable that I haven't done before.
What was the trigger for that? You're a triathlete. Context is that?
Yes. I used to play sports. I realized over a period of time, I was telling you, right, playing football for the Delhivery team, and I realized I was so unfit, I hadn't touched the ball for 20 minutes. And I said, look, this is not an acceptable...
Wow, I must congratulate your team, because I cannot, they must be a really solid team to not pass the ball consciously to their CEO, because in many organizations, they'll be like, boss, we got to pass him. Do not make the CEO look bad. But if your both side teams ensure that you didn't get the ball, then my respect for them just went up.
Yeah,
right?
And central midfield. So, oh man, that was really embarrassing, right? And I just said, look, this is not, I can't, live like this.
How many years ago was this?
9 years ago, 2017. 16. And then I said, we need to do something about this. And so I just signed up for the Amritsar half marathon. I'd never run more than a kilometer in my life outside of the...
So, I mean, help me understand this arc, right? You don't get the football as a center midfielder for 20 minutes. And your solution to that is, I'm going to sign up for a marathon.
Yeah.
What is that? What's going on in your head and saying?
What went on in my head is, I'm not fit. That was number one.
Why a marathon? Why not, let's say, for instance, hit the gym?
The easiest sport over time, I've realized, and it's my recommendation to everybody, the easiest thing to get into, unless you have any other reasons not to, is running. All you need is a pair of shoes. And that was it. My logic was, I have no excuse for, gym. I can make all kinds of arguments about why I didn't go. I'll first lose weight, then I'll go to the gym, then I'll do this and I'll do this. It's too much, right? And then you also say, I need to get my diet in shape, etc. I say, well, running, I need nothing. I can literally wear my shoes in the morning and I can start running. And I can choose what speed I want to run at. I can walk if I don't feel like it. And that's how I got started. And the goal has to be uncomfortable enough. So it wasn't, I'm going to run 3 kilometers or whatever. You need to sort of publicly commit. So I told everybody I knew I'm going to Amritsar. So that would be really embarrassing if I didn't. And fortunately, one of my friends agreed to drive me to Amritsar. And on the spur of the moment, he said, okay, you know what, even I'll run it. And
what was this, a half marathon?
Full marathon? Half marathon.
Half marathon.
So we just rocked up to Amritsar and we said we'll run. And at the end of it, we realized
Did you train for it?
I thought I did.
A half marathon is what, 25 kilometers?
21.
21.
I thought I did, which is that one day I ran 6 kilometers.
What? You went to run a half marathon having run?
Man, no one tells you how much 21 kilometers is till you actually run it the first time. Yeah.
Yeah, because I know folks who practice 6 months to run a 10K. So I was like surprised that
but that's where all of the sports from earlier in life hopefully helped. And then I realized I just love it. I loved running. And you meet all kinds of interesting people when you run.
And you said earlier that you said you were a competitive swimmer. So that completes part 2 of the triathlon trilogy. Third one is cycling.
Yes, I knew how to ride a cycle. Then the only question, triathlon is a sport.
So how do you go from marathon to triathlon?
I showed up in Goa. I saw an ad.
Goa triathlon.
Yeah, I saw an ad which said Ironman Goa 70.3, sign up here. So I didn't even think about it. I just clicked on it. I said, what is a triathlon? I said, you have to swim 1.9 kilometers. I said, I could probably do that. You have to cycle for 90. I said, look, I know how to ride a cycle. And I said, you have to run a half marathon. I said, I've already done that. So I just signed up. I had no clue, as usual.
When did you do your first triathlon?
2019. I signed up 2018.
Did you finish it?
Yeah, I did. Triathlon is a sport where the finishing rates are actually pretty high because you can take your time. And the joke, of course, is
what is the hardest part? The swim, the cycling bit, or the running bit?
It's usually by virtue of the structure of the event, it's the running because it comes at the end.
In the end, you're already tired.
I struggle with the swim the most these days.
Open water swimming? Is that why it's tough or something else?
No, there's just thousands of swimmers in the water. So open water is not the problem. It's just you're getting hit on one side. There are swimmers at various speeds. It's not the same as running where you can easily kind of move around people. So it's a little bit of chaos at the start. Your heart rate is high. You're kind of a little nervous when you get in. But yeah, it's a 4-year-old sport, man. A 4-year-old can technically swim, can ride a cycle, can walk. So,
this question that I've asked most guests on First Principles. There is this cliche that we are the average of the 5 people that we spend the most amount of time with. Who are they for you?
My parents, still, of course. A couple of my closest friends.
Where do they live, your parents?
My folks split time between here and Ahmedabad and Nagpur. A couple of my closest friends were also from Delhivery, co-founders, Suraj, Kapil. Yeah, they're sort of...
All right. I want to go back to something that you said about multi-decadal visions. A lot of what you explained about, you said when you started Delhivery in 2011, you folks put a vision saying that this is what we want to make, etc. And a lot of the stuff that you've made, including mesh networks, design, thinking from the bottom up, I get all of that. Sitting in 2025, when you look forward and you look at, let's say, 2035, what do you think is going to be the decadal challenges, or what's the next unlock? I'm not asking for any forward-based
Sure.
guidance or projection, because I understand you're a public a limited company, but I'm asking purely from a evolution of delivery, and especially because you also said that everything now is coming together. You folks do all sorts of things now, right? Not just one or two markets. So when you take everything that you've done, everything that you are, and you look forward 10 years, what's the next waves that you think you will have to be ready for? Or
The biggest challenge and the biggest wave that will affect logistics over the next 10 years, two things. One is a fundamental change in, and there will be massive localization here of what industrial automation and robotics will look like. And I'll explain why. The conventional wisdom has always been that Indian labor is inexpensive and therefore,
right,
that's
throw
sort of
people
how,
at the problem.
throw people at the problem and, build these sort of networks of micro entrepreneurs and whatever gig workers who can do things at, very low cost. My view is that doesn't hold up logically for two reasons. One is productivity adjusted labor costs in India are pretty high. They're actually not very low. The second is
By that you mean that even though the salary that you pay to an Indian may be low on global standards, the productivity of that Indian is much lower
Yes.
than global standards. So
Yes.
therefore, it doesn't look all that cheap
No
once you
longer.
adjust for productivity.
Which is one. The second, more insidious problem is that those wage rates are unsustainable. You can't have a country where, and I've said this I don't know how many times, you can't have a country which is divided into people who live in condos and people who deliver to people who live in condos. That's a recipe for sort of long-term
Social
failure.
unrest.
Social
I've said
unrest,
that.
it won't work.
Yeah, that's true.
And I struggle to see how you actually get to a point where you find enough people to feed this machine unless you kind of make the job much, much easier, right? Going out and driving, it's going to be 50 degrees in Delhi in another month. We're already trying to figure out, saying, how do you, in good conscience, I can't send people out at 2 p.m. saying, go and deliver packages
and
to
the
people.
delivery times, especially in quick commerce, coming down and
10
down.
minutes,
It's like
15
10
minutes.
minutes, 12 minutes, 5 minutes. I mean, I hate to say this where I stay, again, because I stay in Bangalore. It's where a lot of these experiments are like, really dense. 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes are delivery times.
You have to think of alternate forms. I understand the consumer need. I understand the value proposition that, I'd love to have things in 8 minutes and 10 minutes. But the solution is not to put a underpaid man on a bike in a bad environment and get him to drive faster. You have to think about design.
Because he has no other options.
Because he has no other options. And sort of you can always abstract it away by saying he's an independent contractor and he's making this decision for his life. But that's not correct. When you limit the number of choices, there's only one decision. So I think that is the real challenge in India. How do you make this sustainable? How do you make the labor situation sustainable? How do you make the job easier? Lifting boxes, and putting them into trucks which are massive. We're aware of the fact that it leads to long-term sort of, health complications. So things like, for example, exoskeletons are an interesting area. Loading devices are an interesting area. So all of this will change. The problem is you can't bring solutions from Europe or from the US or elsewhere because the Indian challenges are very complex. You have
not even from China.
Even China is interesting, but very different from India as we've seen. They do high throughput pretty well, but they don't do it in the kind of area constraints that Indian cities present. We went to Shanghai to ZTO's facility. It's about, whatever I remember, is 800,000 square feet. Lovely piece of real estate, right? And doing maybe, whatever, if I remember right at that time, about 1 million packages a day or thereabouts. Not bad. But we realize in India, when we do 1 million packages a day out of one of our largest facilities, the extent of space we have is about 240,000 square feet. So I have to produce more out of less real estate, which is just because India is the way it is.
And also because real estate is more expensive in India.
More expensive, our cities are denser, topographies are more complicated. So you have to figure out local solutions. So I think that's going to be one big wave. And the second is, from a software standpoint, obviously everything that goes with the robotics is one piece. But the second big wave that we're going to have to figure out how to design around to build reliability into our networks is climate change. It's a humongous problem at this point in time. In any given month, our network is disrupted in 5 states with unseasonal rain, unseasonal heat, there's been a landslide or something of the sort, and we need to figure out how to build resilience towards all of these events. I think those are the two big sort of challenges and big waves that Indian logistics companies will be very, very hard pressed to deal with. Everything else it'll change. Roads will change, size of infrastructure will improve, airports will get better, truck farms will become larger. All this is kind of par for the course. It'll happen in any
Right.
case.
I must ask you this, since you mentioned automation / robots, etc. I mean, this drone-based delivery, right? I always struggle to figure out how widespread and sustainable it will be. And I say this having read, so on one hand, you have all this news that it's coming, it's the next big thing, it's going to take over everything. And a certain amount of skepticism, really, is it going to become the same? But then there's also very real examples where it is happening. So it's not hypothetical, it's not technology demonstrators. There are countries around the world where drone-based delivery is happening. My question to you is this like, when you look at drone-based delivery, and again, when you look at it over, let's say, a 10-year cycle, how inevitable do you see it as?
I think it's an extremely useful format for extremely specific kinds of deliveries. And we have our own platforms that we use for some, we're trying to use for some of these. I'll give you classic examples, right? Disaster relief. It makes a lot of sense for you at that point to have a fleet of UAVs. You've had floods in J&K. The roads are impassable. The only way to get there is by drone. Then the form factors, getting them right is very important. I think people are still experimenting, so people are going as far as saying 800 kilogram payloads and so on, but those are going to be very hard to build out. I think what you need is fleets of maybe 5 to 8 kilogram, 40 to 80 kilometer kind of endurance limits. They make sense there. Delivery of medicine, for example, highly specific, especially because in rural areas it can be too hard to get life-saving medicine to people in time. I think that makes sense. I'll give you an example in India, which I've always wondered about. There's no clearance for this, and we'd like to perhaps try at some point. Organ delivery between hospitals. Right? Indian cities will not allow you to move an organ between two hospitals in time. Can you use drones there? That becomes exciting. But should your pizza be delivered by drone? I'm firmly in the no camp.
It's interesting that you should say that, because many high-rise buildings these days come with a helipad on top.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So we've thought through that, those people may be in an emergency, so perhaps let's build helipads, and so but we haven't optimized for something which is much easier actually, right? Like, in a life-saving situation, a drone is much smaller, much safer, etc. But we don't have that. All right.